What would you do if the only way to save your mother's life was to carry a stranger's child? Willow Rhodes didn't ask herself that question for long. She said yes before she even learned his name. The contract was clean. The money was real. And the man on the other side of it was supposed to stay a stranger. Cold, distant, untouchable. A Korean billionaire who wanted an heir and nothing else. A transaction. A beginning with a predetermined end. She wasn't supposed to hear him play piano at 2 a.m. She wasn't supposed to notice the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching. And he, Dae-rim Ryu, a man who had built an empire on control and precision, was never supposed to feel anything at all. But contracts can't account for everything. They can't account for the sound of a woman crying in a garden at midnight, or the way a man who never learned how to stay will sit beside her anyway, in the cold, in the dark, saying nothing, because nothing is exactly what she needs. What the contract never said is a story about two people who agreed to keep their distance and forgot, somewhere along the way, how to want that distance anymore. It is a story about what happens when love arrives in the shape of a mistake, and you realize, too late, and then just in time, that it is the truest thing you have ever touched. Sit down. This one is going to cost you something. If this story is already pulling you in, subscribe and don't miss a single chapter. Drop a comment below and tell us, would you have signed that contract? Willow Rhodes was 28 years old the night she sold 9 months of her life. She didn't think of it that way at first. She sat in the waiting area of Atlanta General Hospital in a plastic chair that had been uncomfortable for at least a decade, and she stared at the bill in her hands the way you stare at something that has already happened, with the particular stillness of a person who has run out of options and knows it. Her mother, Diane Rhodes, was 61 years old. She had worked 34 years as a school librarian. She had raised Willow alone, with patience and discipline, and a love so consistent it was almost invisible, the way the best things always are. She had never asked for much. She was not asking for much now. She was just sick, in the specific expensive way that American healthcare made catastrophic, and the number on the bill was a number Willow had no architecture for. The call came at 9:47 p.m. A woman with a measured, professional voice introduced herself as a representative from an elite surrogacy agency called Helix Meridian. She explained that a client, a private individual, identity protected under confidentiality agreement, had a time-sensitive need. The compensation package was substantial. The contract was strict. The arrangement was medical and legal and completely above board. There would be no emotional component, no ongoing relationship, no ambiguity. She named the figure. Willow was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she asked where to sign. She told herself it was practical. She told herself that plenty of women did this, that it was a service, a kindness even, to a family who needed what she could offer. She told herself she would be fine. She was healthy. She was young. She was unattached in the particular way of someone who had been too busy surviving to build anything permanent. She had no relationship to complicate the arrangement, no man who would object, no life that couldn't absorb 9 months of reconfiguration. She didn't let herself think about what came after, about handing over a child she had carried. She wasn't built for that kind of anticipation. She handled what was in front of her. Always had. The rest she would cross when she reached it. She signed the contract at 11:15 p.m. in a conference room that smelled of recycled air and legal caution. She took a copy for herself that she never once opened. She called her mother from the parking lot and told her not to worry about the bill. Diane asked no questions, which meant she understood everything and was choosing, for now, to hold her peace. Willow did not sleep that night, but she did not regret it either. She was on a flight to Seoul 48 hours later, with 1 carry-on bag, a folder of medical documents, and the specific self-possession of a woman who had made her decision and was not going to spend the next 9 months second-guessing it. Dae-rim Ryu was 34 years old, and he had been managing other people's expectations for as long as he could remember. He was the chairman of Ryu Dynamics, a conglomerate that touched technology, real estate, and biomedical research across 12 countries. He had been preparing for that role since he was old enough to sit through a board meeting without fidgeting. His father had been deliberate about it. not cruel, but precise in the way of a man who believed that shaping a child was not so different from shaping a company. You identified the desired outcome. You built the conditions for it. You removed the variables that did not serve the objective. Dayrim had become very good at removing variables. The decision to pursue surrogacy had come the way most of his decisions came, not from impulse, but from calculation. His grandfather's will contained a clause that the family's lawyers had been quietly hoping he'd forget. To maintain full control of his inheritance and voting shares, Dayrim was required to produce an heir before his 35th birthday. He had 11 months. He was not in a relationship. He had not been in a meaningful one in 6 years, and he did not intend to change that. He was not, as his board liked to imagine, indifferent to people. He was careful with them. There was a difference. Careful meant he understood exactly what proximity to him could cost someone. And he had learned, once, at great pain, not to let people close enough for that bill to come due. Surrogacy was the logical solution. Clean. Contractual. No entanglement. The agency would screen for compatibility, health, temperament. The candidate would be compensated generously. The child would be his heir, and, in some way he hadn't fully articulated to himself, his anchor to something beyond spreadsheets and strategy. He had reviewed 12 candidates. He had chosen Willow Rhodes based on a report. Genetic compatibility. Excellent health markers. No complicating personal circumstances. She was a match by every metric the agency measured. The selection was precise, data-driven, and entirely without sentiment. He had not expected her to walk into his house and make it feel different. Sung-ho, 62 years old, silver-haired, and the only person on Earth who spoke to Dayrim with anything approaching candor, had been with the Ryu family for 31 years. He had held Dayrim as an infant. He had driven him to school on mornings when his father was traveling, and his mother was already fading into the particular sadness she never fully left. He had stood at the back of the room during Dayrim's first board meeting and resisted the urge to straighten the young chairman's tie. When Dayrim briefed him on the arrangement, clinical, factual, businesslike, Sung-ho listened with his hands clasped and his expression carefully neutral. He did not say what he was thinking. He had learned that, too, over 31 years. He would wait. He was good at waiting. The house was not what she expected. Willow had prepared herself for something sleek and corporate. Glass and steel. The architectural equivalent of a man who ran 12 companies and had no interest in small talk. What she walked into was a structure that had been built over generations, expanded and refined. A place that carried the particular gravity of a family home despite its scale. There were gardens she could see from the entrance hall. There was art on the walls that looked like it meant something to someone. There was, she would discover later, a piano in a room that was otherwise used for nothing at all. Dayrim Ryu was waiting for her in the main sitting room. He stood when she entered, not a performative gesture, just what he did. And he looked at her the way she imagined he looked at everything, with focus, and a kind of assessment that wasn't unkind but wasn't warm either. She looked back at him with the same energy. She had decided on the flight over that she was not going to be intimidated. She was a professional in an unusual situation, and she would treat it accordingly. He told her the household staff would show her to her rooms. He explained the medical team would contact her in the morning for the first of several scheduled check-ins. He told her she was welcome to use any common area of the house, that her privacy would be fully respected, and that he saw no reason for their paths to cross in any way beyond what the arrangement required. She told him that sounded fine. It did not, as it turned out, sound fine to Sung-ho, who appeared at her doorway 20 minutes later with a tray of tea and a warmth so genuine it caught her off guard. He introduced himself. He told her, with the particular confidence of someone who had earned the right to say what he thought, that the house was better with someone in it who moved through it like they meant to be there. She wasn't sure what that meant, but she liked him immediately. By the end of her first week, she had learned the layout of the gardens, the name of every staff member, and the fact that Dayrim Ryu ate dinner alone in his study every single night, unless he had obligations elsewhere. By the end of her second week, she had accidentally joined him for dinner twice. Once because Sung-ho had, with complete innocence, seated her at the main table without mentioning that Day Rim had come down that evening, and once because it was raining and the garden terrace where she usually ate was unusable, and the study was the only room with food in it. Both dinners were quiet. Neither was uncomfortable. That was the part that surprised her. The first crack appeared in the 7th week. Willow heard it from her room. Music, in the middle of the night, drifting up through the house with the quality of something private. She lay still for a moment, trying to place it, and then she recognized the sound of a piano being played by someone who wasn't performing for anyone. She got up. She didn't plan to. She walked down the stairs in the dark the way you walk toward something before you've decided whether or not to approach it. And she stopped in the doorway of the room she'd noticed on her first day. The room with the piano and nothing else. And she watched Day Rim play. He didn't know she was there. She was certain of that. Because the man at the piano was not the man who had told her their paths need not cross. That man was ordered, closed, economical with himself. This man was playing something that had grief in it, something that didn't resolve where you expected it to resolve. And his shoulders were carrying a weight that had nothing to do with business. She stood there for what felt like a long time. Then she went back to bed without making a sound. The next morning, nothing was different. He was exactly as he always was, composed, courteous, remote, and she was exactly as she always was. But something had shifted, faintly, at the margins of things. Sung-ho noticed. He said nothing. He poured the tea. What followed was not dramatic. It was something subtler and more dangerous. The accumulation of small things that don't announce themselves as significant until you look back and see the shape of what they made. He learned that she read during meals, that she argued with podcasts out loud when she thought no one could hear her, that she was fluent in a particular kind of silence, the kind that wasn't empty, that had texture to it, the silence of someone who had learned to be alone without being lonely. She learned that he was funny, in a dry, oblique way that he seemed to deploy entirely without intention, that he listened more carefully than he spoke, that when Sung-ho made a joke at his expense, and Sung-ho did, regularly, with the impunity of 31 years, he didn't just tolerate it. He smiled, a real one, small and quick, like something escaping. By the 12th week, they were sharing dinner without incident or accident. It had simply become what happened. Neither of them mentioned it. The call from Atlanta came on a Tuesday, at 2:47 in the morning, Seoul time. Willow's aunt, her mother's older sister, who handled things when Willow couldn't, told her, with the careful gentleness of someone delivering news they'd been dreading, that Diane had been moved to the ICU. A complication. The doctors were optimistic, but they wanted family to know. Willow thanked her. She hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed for a moment that stretched in a way moments do when the floor has dropped out of the ordinary world. And then she got up and went outside, into the garden, because she needed air, and she needed to not be inside 4 walls. She sat on the stone bench near the pond. The Seoul night was clear and cool. She wasn't crying. Not yet. She was in the place before crying, the place where everything is very still and very sharp, and the grief hasn't found its form yet. She didn't hear him come out. She became aware of him the way you become aware of warmth, gradually, peripherally. He sat down on the bench, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to pretend he hadn't seen her. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer anything. He just sat there, in the cold, in the dark, with his hands in his lap, present in the specific way of someone who has decided that presence is what's needed, and everything else would be noise. They stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, without looking at him, she told him about her mother. Not everything, just enough. The illness, the bills, why she'd taken the contract. Her voice was steady in the way of someone holding something carefully. He was quiet after she finished. Then he said, very simply, that he would arrange for additional medical support to be made available through the agency, that it was within the parameters of the contract, that she shouldn't read anything into it. He delivered it in exactly the tone of a man who needed very much for her to believe it was logistical. She looked at him then, just for a moment, just long enough to see what he was working to hide. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Sung-ho, who had watched from the upstairs window because he was not above watching, went back to his room and allowed himself a long, quiet exhale. Dae-rim's mother came to the house on a Thursday afternoon in the 16th week. Mrs. Ryu, Park Ji-soo, 70 years old, impeccably dressed, and possessed of the particular authority that came from having built and survived a dynasty, was not a cruel woman. She was something more precise than that. A woman who had learned to love the people she approved of, and to manage, with elegant efficiency, the people she didn't. She had not been consulted about Willow. She arrived in the sitting room where Willow was reading, assessed the situation in approximately 4 seconds, and did not extend her hand. Instead, she sat in the armchair across from her, accepted tea from Sung-ho, who brought it with a serenity that suggested he had prepared for this encounter, and began asking questions that were not quite questions. She asked how Willow was finding Seoul. She asked about her background, her family, her circumstances. Each question was wrapped in the politeness of a woman who had been raised to be impeccable, and each one landed with the precision of something meant to establish exactly what kind of person Willow Rhodes was, and whether that person could be managed. Willow answered everything with the tranquil directness of someone who had grown up with a mother who taught her to occupy her own space without apology. She did not perform. She did not shrink. She looked at Park Ji-soo with the clear, level gaze of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and had decided not to be moved by it. The following week, a representative from the Ryu family's legal office contacted Helix Meridian with an additional offer, a sum of money to be delivered to Willow directly, with no explanation required, in exchange for her voluntary withdrawal from the arrangement. Willow read the offer once. She set it down. She called the agency and declined. Dae-rim found out from his legal team before she had the chance to tell him. He appeared in the doorway of the library where she was working, and looked at her with an expression that had something unreadable in it, something that moved quickly beneath the surface and was gone before she could name it. He told her his mother had acted without his knowledge or consent, and that it would not happen again. She told him she knew, and that she wasn't worried about it. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. Then he left. That night, for the first time, she heard the piano stop mid-piece, and then start again, slowly, differently. Something she didn't recognize. Something that sounded like it was being written in real time. The gala was a quarterly event hosted by Ryu Dynamics, 300 guests, 2 floors of a hotel in Gangnam, and the particular social theater that accompanied serious money and serious power in equal measure. Dae-rim had not intended to bring Willow. The original plan was a carefully managed public absence on her part. She was, in the language of the arrangement, to be kept private. But his head of communications had flagged a specific piece of gossip circulating in certain circles, speculation about why the chairman was arranging an heir without a visible partner. And it had been deemed, from a purely strategic standpoint, useful to present a united front. He had explained this to Willow in exactly those terms. Strategic front. She had looked at him with the expression she sometimes wore that he couldn't fully decode, and said, "Fine. She'd need something to wear." Sung-ho, who had not been involved in this conversation but somehow knew about it within the hour, arranged everything with characteristic quiet efficiency. She walked in on Dae-rim's arm and she did not perform. That was the thing. 300 people in a room calibrated for performance, and she simply existed in it, present, unhurried, genuinely curious about the people she met, laughing at things that were actually funny and not at things that weren't. She spoke with his vice chairman's wife about architecture for 20 minutes and left the woman visibly delighted. She charmed an elderly board member by asking him, with complete sincerity, about the history of a company he'd founded 40 years ago. Dae-rim watched her from across the room for most of the evening. He told himself it was strategic attention. He needed to track how the arrangement was reading publicly. He told himself this several times. It became less convincing each time. In the car on the way home, they were quiet. The city moved past the windows. She was looking out at the lights. He said, and he didn't plan to say it, it simply came out, that she had been remarkable tonight. She turned from the window and looked at him. A beat of silence, the kind that has weight. She told him she was just herself. He said he knew. That was exactly what he'd meant. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the lights, but she was almost smiling. He looked away too. He breathed very carefully, the way you breathe when you are aware, for the first time with full clarity, that you are in a significant amount of trouble. It happened on a Tuesday morning in the 22nd week. Dayrim had been awake since 4. He had gone to the study at 5. He had sat at his desk and looked at the contract, the original, with Willow's signature and his own, for a long time before he understood what he was going to do. He called Sung-ho at 7. Sung-ho arrived at the study door in the way he always arrived, composed, unhurried, with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen everything and judged nothing that wasn't his business to judge. Dayrim placed the contract on the desk between them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he tore it down the center, steadily, without theatrics. Sung-ho looked at the two halves on the desk. He did not react. Dayrim said he was not sure what came next. He said the arrangement, the structure of it, the framing of it, no longer reflected the situation as it actually was. He said he had spent 3 weeks trying to convince himself otherwise, and had arrived at the conclusion that he was not able to want what the contract asked him to want. He said this carefully, like a man reading from something he had only just written. He said he did not know how to do this. He had spent 6 years making certain he would never have to. And here something shifted in his voice. Something that Sung-ho had not heard in a very long time. He said that she was the most honest person he had met in years. That the contract felt like an insult to her. That what he felt for her did not fit inside a contract, and he could not maintain it. Sung-ho was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with great gentleness and very little sentimentality, that this was the most sense Dayrim had made in as long as he could remember. Dayrim told him he didn't know what to say to her. He didn't know where to start. He had no architecture for this. He had dismantled it, methodically, years ago, because it had nearly destroyed him the last time. Sung-ho told him, simply, to start with the truth. The door was open a crack. Neither of them thought to check the hallway. Neither of them knew that she had passed by on her way to the kitchen and stopped. That she had heard his voice, low, serious, unmistakably real, and without meaning to, she had listened. She heard the contract was gone. She heard him say he needed it to end. She assembled those words the way you assemble things when you're afraid, into the shape that confirms what you've always suspected about yourself. That she was, in the end, a transaction. That she had let herself forget that. That forgetting had been the mistake. She did not hear the rest. She went back to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed. She breathed. Then she reached under it and pulled out her suitcase. She left before noon. She left a note on the bed. She had agonized over it. 3 drafts, 2 of which said too much. The final version was 5 words and her name. Thank you for everything. Willow. She had thought about standing in front of him and saying, what, exactly? That she'd heard enough to know where she stood. That she'd made the mistake of forgetting what she was to him, and needed to fix that before it broke something in her that wouldn't recover. She couldn't do it. She was not a woman who fell apart in front of people. She would fall apart later, on her own terms, in her own space. She was good at that. She messaged the agency from the taxi. She transferred her care to a physician in Atlanta who had been listed as a contingency in the contract. She was 22 weeks pregnant, healthy, and furious with herself in the specific way of someone who knew better and did it anyway. Dayrim came upstairs at 1 in the afternoon. He had spent the morning working through what he wanted to say to her, phrased it 11 different ways, discarded 10 of them. He had settled on something honest and direct, the way Sung-ho had told him. Because Sung-ho was right, and he'd known it for weeks. He knocked on her door. No answer. He opened it. The room was neat. The bed was made. The window was open slightly. The curtain moving. The books she'd left on the nightstand were gone. The small photograph of her mother that she'd kept on the dresser was gone. On the center of the bed, a note that said 5 words. Dae-rim stood in the doorway for a long time, long enough for Sung-ho to appear behind him, because Sung-ho always knew when to appear, and look over his shoulder at the empty room and understand everything in the span of a breath. Dae-rim said nothing. Sung-ho said nothing either. He stood there with him, in the doorway, looking at the made bed and the open window and the 5 words on the note. He placed his hand briefly on Dae-rim's shoulder, not a gesture of comfort exactly, more an acknowledgement, and then withdrew it. After a while, Dae-rim picked up the note. He folded it once. He put it in his pocket. He went back downstairs. He sat in the study for 6 hours. He did not eat. He did not work. He sat with the specific stillness of a man who has just understood, with perfect and terrible clarity, exactly what he had that he did not protect. Willow had learned, a long time ago, that the best way to manage grief was to give it very little room to breathe. Keep busy, stay useful, focus on what's in front of you, and not on the shape of the thing you're carrying. She went back to Atlanta and she got busy. Her mother was stable. The ICU scare had resolved, and Diane was back in her regular room, sharper than ever, immediately noticing that Willow had come home early, and asking questions that Willow deflected with the practiced ease of a daughter who loved her mother and would not tell her anything that would make her worry. Diane looked at her daughter's face, really looked, the way mothers do, the way that bypasses words entirely, and said nothing. She let it go. For now, the apartment Willow sublet from a friend was small and warm and smelled like the candles she burned at night when she was trying to sleep. She was 24 weeks along. She felt the baby move for the first time in Atlanta, a flutter, tentative, unmistakable, while she was sitting at the kitchen table at 10 at night, eating cereal because she hadn't felt like cooking. She put her hand on her stomach. She stayed very still. She cried. Then, for the first time since Seoul, not about the baby, about all of it. About her mother and the money and the contract and the piano at 2 a.m, and a man who had sat beside her in the dark and said nothing because nothing was exactly right. And about the fact that she had been so careful and it had happened anyway. And about the 5-word note and the taxi and the flight and the long, quiet months ahead. She cried for about 20 minutes. Then she washed her face, finished her cereal, and went to bed. She was, as she had always been, going to be fine. She was just going to be fine while hurting. That was all. The weeks after Willow left were the quietest the house had ever been. Dae-rim worked. He worked with the focused, slightly ferocious energy of a man who had decided to be productive, because the alternative was to sit still and think. And sitting still and thinking was not something he was currently able to do without consequences he wasn't prepared to manage. He did not play the piano. Sung-ho watched. He waited. He brought tea and meals with the steady reliability that had characterized 31 years of service, and he said nothing beyond what was necessary for exactly 3 weeks. On the 22nd day after Willow's departure, he knocked on the study door at 8 p.m, came in without waiting for an answer, a liberty he had always taken and Dae-rim had never objected to, and closed the door behind him. Dae-rim looked up from his desk. Sung-ho stood with his hands clasped in front of him, in the posture of a man who has decided to say something and is going to say it regardless of reception. He spoke carefully, choosing each word. With respect, and with 31 years of loyalty as his standing, he wanted to say that Dae-rim was being profoundly foolish. Not unkind, he clarified. Not wrong in his feelings. Profoundly, specifically foolish in his inaction. Dae-rim set down his pen. Sung-ho continued. He explained that he knew what Dae-rim had said in this room on that Tuesday morning. And he knew what Willow had heard, because he had reviewed the household security log and seen exactly where she had been in the corridor and when. She had heard half of a conversation and built a story out of it, the way people do when they are afraid and already half convinced they don't deserve the thing they want. She left because she thought Dae-rim was relieved to be done with her. She left to protect herself, And Dayrim had been sitting in this room for 3 weeks, allowing her to believe something that was not true. The silence that followed had weight. Dayrim said he didn't know how to fix it. Sung-ho said it with the simplicity of something obvious, the kind of thing that had been there all along, waiting for someone to say it aloud. Get on a plane. Dayrim booked the flight before Sung-ho had left the room. He took no assistant, no security detail. One bag. The flight from Seoul to Atlanta was 14 hours. He spent most of them by the window, not sleeping, watching the darkness over the Pacific give way to the gray light of early morning over North America. He had prepared extensively in the way of his nature. He knew what he wanted to say, had turned it over and refined it. But somewhere over the Rockies, he let go of the preparation. He decided he was going to say it plainly, whatever came, because that was what she deserved and what he owed her. The neighborhood was quiet in the way of residential Atlanta on a weekday morning. He stood on the sidewalk in front of the house for a moment longer than he needed to. He thought about the version of himself that would have sent a representative, that would have handled this through channels, that would never have been standing on a sidewalk in Atlanta with one bag and no plan beyond telling the truth. He walked up and rang the bell. The woman who opened the door was not Willow. She was Diane Rhodes, 61 years old, dressed in a cardigan, with eyes that were unmistakably her daughter's, and an expression that suggested she had been a school librarian for 34 years and had therefore encountered every variety of human being and was not startled by any of them. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said he must be the foolish Korean man. He said, "Yes, ma'am." He believed he was. Something shifted in her expression. Not softness exactly, but an assessment completed. She opened the door wider and told him to come in. She said Willow was at her prenatal appointment and would be back in an hour, and that he could sit in the kitchen and tell her what he planned to say to her daughter, and she would tell him if it was good enough. He sat in the kitchen. He told her everything, all of it, the contract, what he'd said to Sung-ho, what Willow had heard, what he hadn't known how to say before she left. He said it plainly, without making it poetry, the way Sung-ho had advised, and the way Diane's expression made clear was the only currency she accepted. Diane listened with her hands around a mug of coffee, and the stillness of a woman who had been hearing things clearly her whole life. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she told him that was better than she'd expected. He asked if it was good enough. She told him that wasn't for her to say, but that her daughter didn't need poetry. She needed honesty. And he had enough of it. She told him not to waste it trying to make it pretty. He nodded. He sat with that. He heard the front door open 47 minutes later. Willow stopped in the kitchen doorway. She was 27 weeks along. She looked tired in the way of someone who had been carrying too many things for too long. She was wearing a coat she hadn't taken off yet, and she was holding a folder from the clinic. And she stood very still in the doorway looking at Dayrim sitting at her mother's kitchen table. Diane looked between them, stood, picked up her mug with the ease of a woman who had planned this moment, and announced she was going to rest. She paused as she passed Willow in the doorway and put her hand briefly on her daughter's arm. Not a word, just a hand, which was sometimes more. Then she left. The kitchen was very quiet. Willow set the clinic folder on the counter. She kept her back to him for a moment, her hand resting on the folder. Then she turned around, but she didn't quite look at him. She looked at a point just past his shoulder, the studied neutrality of someone determined not to give anything away. She told him he didn't have to come all this way. The agency could have handled whatever needed handling. He stayed where he was at the table. His voice was quiet and entirely certain when he told her this had nothing to do with the agency. That made her look at him. She was working very hard at keeping her face still, and she was mostly succeeding, except that he had spent months learning her face, the small tells she didn't know she had, and he could see exactly where the effort was. He asked her what she had heard. When she was in the hallway, he asked her to tell him exactly what she had heard. She was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, measuring the words, she had heard him say the contract was gone, that he needed it to end. He nodded slowly. And before that, he asked, what had she heard before that? A pause. She hadn't been listening from the beginning, she said. She didn't know. He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on the table, and held her gaze. Before that, he told her, he had said that what he felt for her didn't fit inside a contract, that he had destroyed it because it felt like an insult to her, that he didn't know how to say any of it to her face. The kitchen was very quiet. He didn't look away. He told her there was something she needed to understand. He had spent 6 years making sure he would not be standing in a room like this one, saying what he was about to say, because the last time he had let someone in that far, it had cost him more than he knew he had. He had rebuilt everything after, made it orderly, made it safe, designed a life with no room for exactly this. He paused. Outside the window, a car passed. The afternoon light was moving slowly across the kitchen floor. And then, he said, she had walked into his house and made it feel like a home. He had been fighting that for months. He was done fighting it. He was not good at this. He had very little practice, and she would find that out soon enough if she let him. But he knew what was true. What was true was that he didn't want her to leave. He didn't want to not know her. He wanted her to stay, not because of the contract, not because of the baby, because of her. Because she argued with podcasts and cried quietly in gardens and looked at people like they were worth seeing. Because she had sat at his dinner table like she had every right to be there, which she did. He stopped. He looked at her steadily, giving her the silence to do something with it. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he told her he had crossed an ocean for the first time in his life without a plan. That should tell her something. Willow had been very still through all of it. Her coat was still on. Her hands were at her sides. Her eyes were doing something she was working extremely hard not to let them do, and she was losing that fight, and she knew it. Her voice was barely above a murmur when she said it. She had thought she was a transaction. He rose from the table then. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her, close enough that she would have to choose to step back if she wanted distance. She didn't move. He told her, with the particular steadiness of someone who has finally stopped negotiating with what they feel, she was never a transaction, not even on the day they met. She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He didn't try to fill the silence or soften it or manage it. He just stood there, present, the way she had needed him to be present once before, in a cold garden, in the dark. When she finally spoke, something small had broken loose in her voice. Not grief exactly, closer to relief. She told him he was very bad at this. He told her he knew. The corner of her mouth moved, barely, reluctantly. She told him they were going to have to work on that. And something in him came loose, quietly, completely, like something that had been held under tension for years and finally, gratefully, released. He took her hands, carefully, the way you hold something worth being careful with. She didn't pull away. She cried, not the performance of tears, but the real kind. The kind that comes when you've been holding something for so long that the body finally just refuses. He didn't try to stop it or fix it or make it smaller. He stayed there, holding her hands, the way she had once needed someone to stay without doing anything at all. They stood in her mother's kitchen for a long time. The afternoon light crossed the floor and reached the far wall. In the next room, Diane Rhodes set down her tea, looked at the ceiling, and smiled the smile of a woman who had waited a long time to see her daughter held like that. He stayed in Atlanta for 3 weeks. Sung-ho managed Seoul with the competence of a man who had been quietly managing everything for 31 years anyway, and did not require supervision. He sent brief, informative messages each morning, and one slightly less brief message at the end of the first week that read only, "I am glad you went." Those 3 weeks were not cinematic. They were not the sweeping, music-scored reconciliation of someone who had never lived through the actual work of beginning something real. They were careful and sometimes awkward and occasionally, unexpectedly funny, like the Tuesday when Diane appointed herself nutritional director of Willow's pregnancy and presented Dayrim with a handwritten meal plan covering the remaining 13 weeks, and he received it with the solemn seriousness of someone reviewing a board proposal. And Willow laughed until she had to sit down. He learned the shape of a day not organized around work. He learned that Diane's kitchen table was the center of the household's emotional life, that serious things were discussed over coffee and not in formal settings. He learned that Willow needed quiet in the mornings and company in the evenings, and that these were not negotiable. She learned that he was nervous in ways he would never announce, that he overcorrected toward formality when he was uncertain, that the sign he was comfortable was that he stopped being precise and started being himself, which was wry and observant and, occasionally, unexpectedly gentle. Diane, for her part, watched all of this with the satisfaction of a woman who had waited a long time to see her daughter looked at the way this man looked at her daughter. She said nothing about it, because she was not a woman who needed to narrate what was already visible. They flew back to Seoul together at the end of the 3rd week. Willow was 30 weeks along. The house felt different when she walked back into it. Or maybe it was the same and she was different. Or maybe they were both different. The house and the woman and the man who walked in behind her and stood in the entrance hall looking at everything as though seeing it for the first time. Sung-ho was waiting. He looked at the two of them, standing close, not performing closeness, actually close, and bowed his head slightly. Then he told them, with the composed tone of a man resuming normal operations, that dinner would be in 30 minutes. He had made the soup Willow liked. She turned and looked at Dayrim. He was watching Sung-ho disappear toward the kitchen with the expression of a man who was, for the first time in a very long time, exactly where he was supposed to be. She arrived on a Sunday morning in early spring. The labor was 12 hours. Not easy, not catastrophic. The particular sustained intensity of something that asks everything of you, and then, at the end of it, replaces everything it took. Dayrim was there for all 12 hours. He had prepared for this, the way he prepared for everything, and the preparation was useless in exactly the way Sung-ho had warned him it would be. He held Willow's hand and said very little, because very little was what was needed, and he had learned that, finally. He was present in the way he had learned to be present, fully, without calculation, without the instinct to manage or optimize or control. Just there, holding on. Diane had flown in from Atlanta 2 weeks earlier, and had taken over the house with the serene authority of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this. She had reorganized 2 kitchen cabinets, befriended Sung-ho over a shared love of very strong tea, and expressed approximately 4 opinions per day about the nursery decor, all of which were ultimately implemented. Sung-ho had begun teaching Diane a small amount of Korean and learning a small amount of English from her, an exchange conducted at the kitchen table each morning with great mutual patience and occasional collective laughter that could be heard from the 2nd floor. In the weeks between their return from Atlanta and the birth, something else had happened, something smaller and quieter than the large dramatic things, but in its way, just as significant. Park Ji-soo had come back to the house. She had come alone this time, without the formality of an appointment, and she had asked to speak with Willow privately. Sung-ho had brought tea and closed the door, and whatever passed between the 2 women in that sitting room remained between them. Willow never told Dayrim the specifics, and he never asked. What he knew was that his mother had come in stiff and left with something softer around her eyes. What he knew was that Willow, afterward, had told him only that Park Ji-soo loved him in the specific, imperfect way of a woman who had never been taught how, and that this did not make her a villain. What he knew was that his mother had called him 2 days later and told him, in the careful, measured language of someone saying more than the words contained, that the child would carry the Ryu name well. The inheritance clause, as it turned out, required no dramatic resolution. The family's legal team confirmed that an acknowledged heir, regardless of the circumstances of birth, satisfied the terms of his grandfather's will. The voting shares were secured. The board was informed. The machinery of the dynasty continued, as it always had, indifferent to the human lives it ran alongside. Dayrim found he cared about the dynasty considerably less than he once had. It was a full house now, a loud one. A house that smelled of cooking and sounded like multiple languages and had people moving through it with purpose and love and the particular beautiful chaos of a family assembling itself. Dayrim, who had spent years designing a life with no room for this, found he had no idea how he had tolerated the quiet. The nurse came through the door carrying a small bundle wrapped in white, and she said, with the warmth of someone who loved this part of the job, that they had a daughter. Willow made a sound that wasn't a word. Dayrim made no sound at all. The nurse placed her in Willow's arms, and she was perfect and small and furious at the inconvenience of existence in the particular way of newborns. With a tuft of dark hair, and a voice she was already using with great conviction, Dayrim sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his daughter, at this specific, impossible, unplannable fact of her. And something broke open in him that he would never be able to close again, and he found he didn't want to. Willow looked up at him. She was exhausted and incandescent, and she had never in her life looked more entirely like herself. She asked what they should name her. He had been thinking about it for weeks. He had made lists. He had discarded them all. He had not been able to find anything that felt true until this moment. Looking at the two of them, the woman who had stayed, who had left, who had let him cross an ocean to find her, who had given him a life he could not have imagined and would not trade, and the daughter who had arrived, like all true things, exactly when she was supposed to. He said her name quietly, the way you say something that has been true for a long time, and you are only now finding the words for it. Seo-yeon, the bond that bloomed. Willow held her close. Dayrim put his arm around Willow's shoulders, carefully, the way he'd held her hands in her mother's kitchen, like something worth being careful with. She leaned into him. The baby quieted. Outside in the corridor, Sung-ho stood with his hands clasped. His eyes were dry. They were absolutely dry. He was not crying. He had simply been standing in a hospital corridor for several minutes with an expression of profound and particular fullness, and there was perhaps some moisture at the outer corner of his left eye that was entirely attributable to the dry hospital air. He straightened his jacket. He went to find Diane to tell her the news, because she deserved to hear it first, and because the kitchen table was where serious things were discussed. Dayrim looked at his daughter for a long moment, at Willow, at the life that no contract could have predicted, and no calculation could have built. He said her name one more time, low and sure and full of everything the contract had never said. Seo-yeon, the bond that bloomed. If this story stayed with you, subscribe so you never miss the next one, and leave a comment. When did you know Dayrim was going to cross that ocean?